Good afternoon. I'm Reverend Alvin Armstead. Stephanie Crowder here. Just want to give you some feedback on Sermon 3. So we have made it through a year of preaching in this first year of the Academia in Preaching program, and just want to provide you some feedback on Sermon 3, entitled A Real Neighbor, as taken from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. I'll start with the sermon itself. And it's clear that you're using the dialectical method, and so your way of engaging your synthesis and your antithesis, and the way in which you go back and sort of bring that all together through your synthesis is very clear. Your thesis, you work very well in presenting that as well. I thought there was very good and clear delineation on what it means to be a consistent and faithful witness. Particularly as what a consistent and faithful witness believes. And so that's very clear, very obvious. What really needed a little bit, I think, more assistance in the sermon. There are no clear references to the colloquy material, so it's not really discernible how you engage the material. I don't think it's anything wrong with a quote here or a reference there from the material, and it wasn't really clearly outlined how you addressed the colloquy material in the sermon. The exegetical work, you talked briefly about Samaritans and Jews and they're not liking each other, but I think a little more would have helped in that regard, so that the congregation could really see just the extent that this Samaritan went to really help his enemy, who later becomes his neighbor. And so I think a little more information about the political history and the cultural history between Jews and Samaritans would have really added some, let me say, homiletical gravitas, as you talk about, who's my neighbor and what does it mean to be a neighbor, and the extent that we go through, the extent that we go to for neighbors, and what we will do for people when they are our neighbors, whether they come from our same background or not. So a little more exegetical work, I think, would have been helpful. The text is just so rich with a lot of exegetical nuggets and behind-the-scenes nuggets, and I think this could have strengthened the sermon. I think I've said before, you have a very solid pulpit presence, good eye contact, and so it was very apparent that you were really trying to work with getting away from the manuscript. So I thought a lot of improvement in this regard. Various vocal inflections and your use of gestures, quite good as well. So again, pulpit presence, speech tone, no markers there, but I could definitely see the development as you're trying to wean yourself off of the manuscript. A lot of alliteration in the sermon, which make for good mnemonic devices or good memory devices. A lot of language, I think, that speaks to people where they are. We talk about Neighbor Class 101 and TV references and explaining parables. And so, again, the language, I think, ways in which you sort of deconstruct what could be very obtuse language and sort of making that live for everybody. Good use of the Huffington Post article in the introduction. I think it's always important to point people to something so that they are constantly reading and you're constantly reading. And again, I want to lift up the way in which you define what a faithful, consistent witness believes. Nice intro, but I just would have pushed a little more in the sermon to talk about, well, who is our neighbor, or what is our neighbor? What do we really go to, the lengths that we go to for our neighbor? So you mentioned beyond me and my, and you talk about the how of what it means to be a good neighbor, but not necessarily who or what is my neighbor. I thought it ironic that you the welcome song for the church, taking the gospel from the neighborhood to the nations, very much aligns with your thesis pursuit of living and trying to be a faithful and consistent witness. This sermon I thought was shorter than the other two, but that's no problem for me, just something that I noted. So thank you for your work with the sermon, and just a few things I highlighted in this written document that sort of evaluates what you've done. As it relates to the reflection paper, you talk about your struggles very openly and very honestly about the challenges of congregational life. and trying to meet people where they are, intergenerational approaches, but yet at the same time wanting to push people to what you say, not just live everyday life, but how does our everyday life sort of merge with our Sunday morning life. And so appreciate it. You're reflecting on that, and I can sort of sense your struggles with trying to meet people where they are, but yet push them beyond where they are. You mentioned quite a bit, some references. Luce's book on preaching at the crossroads, Plantinga's book on reading for preaching. So a lot of references that you include in the reflection paper. You mentioned the overall work of your PPG in your reflection paper, and lift up the Samaritan as that consistent, faithful witness, which again reverts back to your learning curve. And you talk about your own attempts to, again, sort of get away from the preaching manuscript. So appreciate your reflection paper. Well done. And I enjoyed sort of going behind the scenes with you as you were struggling and trying to discern what to do and how to preach this last sermon. The Learning Covenant, you adhere succinctly to that, whereas your Sermon 3 aligns with the notes in the sermon itself, where you talk about being a faithful witness. I would ask, now that you've preached these sermons about what it means to be a faithful, consistent, and witness, I was wondering, have these words changed for you? Did they somehow develop throughout the sermons? So were there ways in which the idea of faithful and consistent and witness sort of changed from Sermon 1 to Sermon 2, from Sermon 1 to Sermon 3? So it'd be interesting going forward how we begin to flesh that out, the ways in which these key words that seem to hinge in your thesis, have they changed, developed, or are there some other words that you may deem apropos going forward? So again, I just wanted to note that, and thinking about your learning covenant and the submission of these 3 sermons. The PPG report, good notations on how the preaching has changed. The notation of less use of the printed text. And so that's what we're trying to see. I mean, it's a preaching degree, and so we want to see how is your preaching maturing, how is it developing. And so one way that you're talking about how your own preaching is changing is through the sermon delivery. So again, becoming less dependent on the manuscript and kind of more dependent on your own sense of studying and what's inside of you as you're preaching. I did have one note in reading the PPG report. Is there any idea if there was more, I guess, dialectical, or is there less celebration? Is there one method that you tend to employ more than the other? And is there any one way that the sermon, the people, the congregation tends to, I don't know, have an affinity for, or they tend to respond to more than the other? So I was just curious about that and your own sort of development. Again, thank you for getting this. It came on Monday, as a matter of fact, so just a little late, but really not late at all, because you all have had tons and tons of snow to deal with. So I'm glad it got here. I pray that you and your family are well. Thank you for this journey, for this process. I look forward to reading your integration paper as you reflect more and begin to merge and coalesce all that you've been doing this entire year. If you need me, send me an email. The phone works. And again, thank you so much for your work, and blessings on you and your family and your church family as well. Take care. Bye-bye.